the silence of a 27-room mansion, a single child's footsteps echoed like a challenge through the billionaire's fortress of suspicion. 10-year-old Maria wasn't supposed to enter Edward Carlyle's office. The billionaire appeared asleep in his leather chair, his safe left wide open, stacks of cash glinting under the chandelier. Every camera in the mansion watched. Every instinct told him no one, not even a child, could be trusted. But Maria stepped forward, notebook in hand, her quiet courage about to defy decades of betrayal. What she did next would freeze Edward in disbelief, unravel the walls he had built around his heart, and prove that sometimes the poorest, most overlooked people hold the richest truths and the power to change a life forever. Before we dive in, if you like this kind of stories of overcoming adversity and justice, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories reach. Now, let's jump back in. Enjoy the story. The office was grand, but not warm. Tall glass windows stretched toward the night, reflecting only the man who sat within. Edward Harrow, 62, leaned back in his leather chair, eyes fixed on the soft glow of his security monitors. He wore a dark three-piece suit even at this late hour, a habit he never abandoned. His silver cufflinks gleamed under the lamp, a subtle reminder of wealth accumulated through decades of hard, ruthless business. Yet for all its splendor, the room felt sterile. A Persian rug lay perfectly centered. The mahogany desk was polished to a mirror sheen. Not a photograph, not a single personal memento adorned the shelves. It was less a workplace than a fortress of order, stripped of any human softness. Edward's finger tapped the side of his tumbler of water. No whiskey tonight, though the crystal glass begged for it. He preferred clarity. His gaze moved from one camera to the next. Hallways, kitchen, staff quarters. Every door was locked, every corridor watched. Trust is the root of ruin, he murmured to himself, voice steady but cold. He remembered faces, partners who smiled, then betrayed him, a brother who stole, even a wife whose loyalty had been traded for comfort elsewhere. One by one, they prove his philosophy true. Everyone has a price, and everyone, sooner or later, takes what is not theirs. His security chief, Reynolds, had once asked if all this surveillance was necessary. Edward's answer had been simple. They will betray you when you blink. I prefer to keep my eyes open. Tonight, as on many nights, he waited. The staff moved quietly, doing their duties with rehearsed precision. None of them dared step outside the lines. He preferred it that way, efficient, controlled, predictable. But then a new pair appeared on the screen. A woman, modestly dressed in a plain gray dress, carrying a small bag. And beside her, a girl of perhaps 10, her hair neatly tied back with a faded blue ribbon. The mother's posture was careful, respectful. The child's eyes, however, darted everywhere, wide, curious, alive in a way Edward had not seen for years within these walls. He sat forward, narrowing his eyes. The housekeeper he had hired came recommended. Quiet, needy but dependable. Yet Edward knew too well that appearances meant little. The child complicated matters. Children notice things. They slipped through cracks. Edward touched the edge of his desk, considering. A small family walking into his fortress. A potential weakness. Or perhaps the perfect opportunity. He leaned back once more, lips tightening into the shadow of a plan. If trust was nothing but an illusion, he would test it, and test it carefully. The night deepened. On the monitors, the new maid and her daughter stepped timidly into the servants' wing. Edward watched without blinking. The next move he decided would be his. Edward's eyes followed the mother and child as they crossed the polished marble foyer. The chandelier above them sparkled like a frozen storm, but neither of them looked up. They seemed intent on keeping their footsteps small, respectful, as though afraid to disturb the silence of the house. The mother's name was Clara Mendoza, 38, widow. Records showed she had no debts, no lawsuits, no stains on her employment. Edward had checked twice. That in itself was suspicious. People always carried shadows. Her dress was simple, almost threadbare, though pressed neatly. She held herself straight, but the fatigue of years weighed in her shoulders. The girl, Maria, clung to her hand at first, then slipped free to step ahead, eyes wide. Her shoes tapped lightly across the polished floor, the blue ribbon bobbing behind her. Edward leaned closer to the screen as Clara bent down to speak softly to her daughter. The microphone caught fragments. "Stay close. Remember what I told you." Maria's voice was a whisper, earnest. "Don't touch what isn't ours." "Good." Clara smoothed the girl's ribbon. "Respect keeps us safe." Edward's jaw tightened. Words rehearsed. Too neat, too virtuous. It sounded like performance. He knew this type. The ones who played innocence until the moment opportunity arrived. Then the mask slipped. He switched cameras, following them as a steward led them toward the servants' quarters. Maria paused at the foot of a long hallway, staring at a gilt-framed painting of a hunting scene. She tilted her head, studying it with more attention than most adults gave to art. Clara pulled her gently along, murmuring, eyes forward. On the upper monitor, Edward caught his own reflection, a pale face sharply lit, ringed by shadows of wealth he no longer trusted. He muttered under his breath, "Too clean. No one is that clean." His hand reached for the small leather-bound notebook he kept beside the desk. He turned a fresh page. His pen scratched a line, "Mendoza. Child, watch carefully. Find a price." He tapped the page once, then set the pen aside. The girl had looked at the painting as though she wanted nothing from it, only to understand. That unsettled him more than greed would have. Greed, he understood. Curiosity, unguarded and pure, was dangerous. Edward sat back in his chair. A decision formed, hard and cold. He would not wait for masks to slip. He would create the test himself. And if they faltered, he would see it with his own eyes. On the screen, the child laughed quietly at something her mother said. That sound, light as a bell, lingered in his ear. Edward reached for the control panel and dimmed the lights of his office. The fortress was ready. The experiment would begin. The next morning arrived muted, light filtering through tall windows in pale streaks. Edward had risen early. His routine was precise. Breakfast untouched, coffee cooling on the silver tray, his mind occupied not with appetite, but with strategy. On the desk lay a small black safe, its door cracked open, just enough to show a stack of crisp banknotes inside. It was deliberate, too visible to be accident, yet subtle enough to suggest neglect. He adjusted the angle of the safe, then glanced toward the chaise near the far wall. The cushions were arranged for comfort, but Edward would not truly sleep there. He would pretend. Eyes closed, breath slow, he would listen. The cameras would do the rest. By mid-morning, Clara was at her duties. She moved with practiced care, dusting shelves, polishing brass fixtures. Maria trailed at her side, sometimes carrying a cloth, sometimes pausing to stare at the carved moldings with fascination. Edward lay back on the chaise, still in his suit, his hand resting loosely across his chest. His breathing slowed. From the corner of his eye, he saw the pair enter the study. Clara gave the room a quick, respectful glance, then directed her daughter toward a bookshelf. The child's steps were light, too light. She moved as if the silence itself could shatter. Then she stopped, her eyes fixed on the safe. Edward's pulse tightened. Through his half-closed lids, he could see her curiosity spark. The small hand hovered in the air. One step forward, another. She peered into the safe, face lit by the sight of the money. Seconds stretched. Edward's jaw clenched, waiting. This was the moment. The mask would slip. Maria reached in. Her fingers brushed the top of the stack. Edward held his breath. But instead of taking, she withdrew. She looked over her shoulder toward her mother, who was bent over polishing a candlestick. Then, with quiet care, the girl pushed the door of the safe shut until it clicked. She even patted it once, as though tucking it safely to sleep. The sound was soft, final. Edward's chest tightened in surprise. His eyes opened just a fraction, watching the child step back and return to her mother's side. She said nothing. Her face held no guilt, only calm. Silence filled the room. For the first time in years, Edward had no ready thought, no cynical explanation. The fortress within him felt strangely hollow, as though some unseen draft had slipped through a crack. On the chaise, he lay still, stunned, frozen in disbelief at what he had just witnessed. Edward sat alone in his office, the monitors glowing before him. His face, stern as carved stone, was touched by a faint tremor of doubt. He replayed the footage from earlier that day. The safe, the child, her hand hovering, the pause that felt like eternity. And then, the act. Not theft, not even hesitation born of fear. It was deliberate. She closed the safe, sealing the money away as though guarding it for him. Edward leaned forward, elbows pressing against the desk. He ran the clip again. Again. The sound of the soft click echoed in his mind. What did she gain from it? He whispered into the empty room. What did it cost her to resist? He pressed the intercom. A voice answered. Reynolds, the security chief. Yes, sir. Edward asked, casual in tone. Do you believe people can act against their own interest? Without expecting something in return. A pause. Then Reynolds replied, cautious. In my experience, sir, everyone has a reason. Might be fear, pride, or reward. No one does anything for nothing. Edward switched off the line before Reynolds could ask more. The answer did not soothe him. It echoed his own creed, yet failed to explain what he had seen. He turned to the file he had ordered on Clara Mendoza, widow of a factory worker. Lost her husband to an accident no insurance had ever compensated. Now, she worked for less than she deserved. Bills piled high. Medical care for her aging mother unpaid. Poverty pressed in on every side. And still, the child resisted temptation that would have fed them for months. Edward sat back, his hand trembling faintly against the arm of the chair. The room felt colder than before. He thought of his brother, who had stolen from him under the guise of trust. He thought of a partner who had forged documents to bleed profits. Their betrayals had shaped him into iron. But this act of honesty, irrational, pure, uncalculated, it gnawed at the iron. He rose, walking slowly to the tall window. Beyond the glass, the city lights shimmered. So many desires, so many hidden prices waiting to be paid. Yet in his own fortress, something had refused to yield. Edward's reflection in the glass looked back at him. A man unsettled, his certainty shaken. One test was not enough. He would press further. He would dig until he found the fracture. Turning from the window, Edward whispered to himself, no one is beyond measure, not even them. And with that, he resolved to test again. The following afternoon, the study was empty, but for Edward. He had muted the desk lamp, sitting in shadows, waiting. The security feed showed Clara in the staff wing with her daughter. Their voices carried faintly through the microphone hidden near the ceiling. Maria's tone was eager, a child confessing a secret. Mama, I saw a box open in the big room. It had money. Lots. I closed it so no one would take it. There was a pause. Clara set down the linens she was folding. The weight of her silence pressed heavy. Then her voice, low but sharp, filled the space. Maria, you must never do that again. Never. The girl's voice faltered, but it was open. What if? No. Clara knelt, so her face was level with her daughter's. The microphone caught the tremor in her words. We are not like the others here. People like us, we are already suspected before we do anything. If you step into rooms that aren't ours, if you touch what isn't yours, they won't ask questions. They will only point, and we will lose everything. Maria's eyes lowered. Her fingers twisted the ribbon in her hair. I only wanted to help. Clara's voice softened, weary but firm. I know, little one, you have a good heart, but a good heart must learn to be careful. It is not enough to be honest. We must look more honest than anyone else. That is how we survive. Edward sat back in the dark, her words pressing against him like stones. His philosophy echoed back at him, twisted. Where he had once claimed everyone has a price, Clara had carved out the opposite creed. Some must live without one, or be crushed by suspicion. He rubbed his forehead, unsettled. On the feed, Maria tucked the folded linens into a basket. Then, without a word, she slipped away, carrying one neatly pressed cloth in her arms. Moments later, Edward's office door creaked open. He looked up as the child stepped in, small hands holding the folded cloth. She placed it gently on the armrest of his chair. For you, sir, she said softly. Her eyes met his. No guile, no fear, only simple kindness. Then she turned and left, her ribbon trailing behind her. Edward touched the cloth, its fabric smooth under his fingertips. Something shifted within him, quiet but undeniable. The fortress he had built around his heart thinned by another stone. Edward sat at his desk, a velvet case before him. Inside, nestled against black lining, were jewels, cufflinks set with onyx, a watch of gold, a pearl pin once belonging to his late wife. He had not touched these things in years. They carried no warmth, only weight. He lifted the case and set it upon a side table near the door, deliberately out of place. To any passerby, it was temptation waiting to be claimed. He moved to the far corner of the room, where a heavy curtain concealed a narrow alcove. There he stood, silent as a shadow, hidden from view yet close enough to see everything. Minutes passed before Clara entered with Maria. The mother went straight to the shelves, dusting with steady strokes, her eyes fixed on her work. Maria lingered near the door. Her gaze fell on the open case. The jewels gleamed in the fading light, sparks of gold and pearl. She stepped closer, breath catching, not in greed but wonder. Edward's hand clenched behind the curtain. He knew this pattern. Curiosity, then possession. Children did not resist forever. But Maria did not reach for them. She bent closer, studying the watch as though it were fragile. Then she frowned. "Mama," she whispered, "someone left these out. What if they get lost?" Clara turned, eyes widening at the sight. "Don't touch," she said sharply. Maria straightened. "I didn't, but they don't belong here." Her small hands hovered, uncertain, then she made a decision. She lifted the velvet case carefully, holding it with both palms as though carrying something sacred. She walked across the room and placed it gently on Edward's desk. "There," she murmured. "Safe." Clara approached, her expression torn between fear and relief. She rested a hand on her daughter's shoulder. "You have a good heart," she said quietly. Then, after a pause, "just be careful with it. The world does not always honor hearts like yours." Edward, hidden in shadow, felt the words strike him. A memory rose unbidden, his father once warning him, "Do not show your heart, Edward. They will cut it from you." He had obeyed, building walls higher than trust could climb. Now, before him, a child carried integrity not as armor, but as instinct. And a mother, weary yet unbroken, taught caution not to harden, but to protect. Edward exhaled slowly, unseen. The fortress within him cracked further. Late evening settled over the mansion. Edward had returned to his office, but sleep did not tempt him. The house had grown still, save for the faint creak of floorboards in the servants' wing. Through the hidden microphones and monitors, he could hear Clara speaking softly into a phone, voice low and trembling. Yes, I understand," she said, pausing to take a shaky breath. "It's been hard. The bills, the rent, the hospital visits. I don't know how we'll manage next month." Edward's fingers flexed against the edge of his desk. He leaned closer, drawn to her words. The camera captured the curve of her shoulders, slumped under the weight of her life. She spoke of loans denied, of nights without proper sleep, of her mother's failing eyesight, all the quiet calamities that a family could carry without complaint. And yet, Clara continued, her voice firmer now, almost proud. "We don't ask for charity. We can't. Maria watches. She must see that honesty and hard work are stronger than sympathy. I will not let her think that our values are for sale." Edward exhaled slowly, the sound almost a whisper in the room. He remembered his own betrayals, the faces of those who had taken advantage of trust, partners, friends, even family. Each act of greed had left him colder, more calculated, more certain that integrity was a fiction. But here, in these quiet words, he saw something impossible. A mother, stripped of comfort and safety, clinging to principle. A child learning, by example, that morality could persist even in desperation. Edward's mind flickered to memories long buried. His first business partner, smiling while forging documents. His brother, laughing as he emptied accounts. His own wife, leaving quietly with possessions he had not noticed gone until too late. Trust had been a trap every time. And yet, here it was again, unbidden, alive in the Mendoza household. He sank into his chair, watching Clara pace, occasionally pausing to rub her tired hands together. The juxtaposition of their lives, his sterile opulence and her unadorned struggle, pressed against his chest like a weight he could not lift. Edward realized, sharply, that his fortress was cracking, not from threat or theft, but from something he had never truly counted on: observation of unguarded virtue. It was illogical, inconvenient, and deeply unsettling. Maria's small, quiet actions throughout the day, her instinctive integrity, combined with Clara's unwavering guidance, began to erode the certainty Edward had clung to for decades. His cynicism faltered. The walls he had built to guard against betrayal no longer felt sufficient. He closed his eyes for a long moment, imagining a life where trust was possible, where someone could act purely without calculation. The thought felt foreign. It stirred something in him, fragile but undeniable. The fortress, it seemed, had a fissure now. Edward opened his eyes. Tomorrow, he would act differently. He watched the monitors, noting every subtle movement in the mansion. Clara and Maria were already at work, the girl carrying laundry down the long hall, the mother dusting shelves with deliberate care. But Edward's attention shifted elsewhere, to the quiet shadow that had begun to loom over the household. Harland, his senior butler, stood near the kitchen doorway, hands clasped behind his back. His uniform was immaculate: navy tailcoat, crisp white shirt, black tie knotted perfectly. His posture was precise, almost rigid. Yet there was a tension, a subtle stiffness in the way he observed the newcomers. Edward's eyes narrowed. Harland had been with him for 20 years, loyal in appearance, discreet in service. But now, the butler's glances lingered too long on Clara, on Maria, and then back at Edward, measuring reactions, calculating. From the monitors, Edward caught a fragment of Harland's muttered words, though muffled. Too soft, far too soft. This house cannot bend to strangers. Later, as Edward returned to his desk, he heard the faint clatter of a tray in the kitchen. Harland emerged, balancing silver dishes, careful to maintain composure. But his expression betrayed a simmering resentment, subtle yet unmistakable, as if he were carrying a personal grievance against the intrusion of honesty into his meticulously ordered world. Edward stayed silent, watching. Harland made a show of straightening linens in the staff quarters, but paused at the entrance to the storage room. He glanced toward the staircase where Maria had been standing moments before, studying the railing. His lips pressed into a thin line. Then, as though thinking no one observed, he slipped a small note beneath a folding table, a seed planted in shadow. Edward's chest tightened. The butler's every action seemed layered with hidden purpose. There was a subtle choreography to his movements, politeness masking suspicion, attention to duty masking ambition. Later, Maria, curious as ever, noticed the note peeking from under the table. She reached for it, tilting her head with a puzzled frown. But before she could pick it up, Harland appeared at the doorway. His voice was smooth, dismissive. "Nothing for you here, child. Best leave it be." Maria's gaze lingered, perceptive and wary. For a brief moment, her innocence clashed with Harland's practiced concealment. She understood, not fully, not yet, that something darker was threading through the household. Edward leaned back in the shadows of his office, watching the interplay. The first seeds of threat were planted, invisible to most, but he saw clearly. Harland's loyalty was now fractured. His ambition and envy would test the newcomers in ways Edward had not yet orchestrated. And Maria, observant and brave, had already begun to notice. The game within the fortress had a new player, and Edward knew the rules were about to change. He sat in a high-backed chair, reviewing ledgers he seldom needed, while Maria quietly arranged flowers in a small vase on the side table. Her movements were careful, deliberate, yet not timid, a child's curiosity tempered by instinct. Edward cleared his throat. "Maria," he began, voice neutral, "you've been here a week. Do you like it?" She paused, hands stilling over the pedals. Then she looked up, her eyes clear, unflinching. "I like it," she said softly. "But you look lonely." Edward froze. The words, simple as a bell, echoed louder than any accusation. He felt a flicker of defensiveness. "Lonely?" he asked, tone clipped. "I have everything I need." She tilted her head. "But you sit by yourself. You watch everyone. You have all these things, and yet you look lonely." Edward blinked, unsure how to respond. For decades, he had built walls higher than most could climb. His wealth had been both shield and prison. No one had ever asked a question like this. No curiosity, no accusation, only observation. "Why do you care?" he said finally, voice low. I see," Maria replied, her small hands folded neatly in front of her. "Some people think that having many things means having happiness. But you look at people like you're expecting them to trick you. Why do you have so much money but look so lonely?" Edward felt a tightening in his chest, a rare vulnerability brushing against his carefully constructed armor. Her words were not judgment, not plea. They were a statement of truth. Before he could answer, Clara appeared in the doorway, her expression gentle but firm. "Maria," she said softly, "let's finish the flowers." "Edward, I'll take the child." Maria nodded, then lingered a moment longer, eyes meeting his. Edward realized the question was still there, lingering, pressing. He watched them leave, feeling the room suddenly emptier, colder. He turned back to the golden light falling across the table. Papers, books, ledgers, all wealth, all control, yet none of it answered the question Maria had asked. The child's simple honesty had pierced a wall he had built against the world. Edward exhaled, slow and measured, realizing the weight of his isolation. For the first time in decades, he felt the quiet stirrings of introspection, of self-doubt. Her question was small, yet it carried a truth he could not ignore. He remained seated, watching the sunlight shift, alone with the echo of her words. "Why do you have so much money, but look so lonely?" The next morning, Edward sat at his desk with a leather envelope before him. Inside was a sum of money, significant enough to cover Clara's bills for months, disguised as a performance bonus for her service. He had calculated every detail, ensuring no trace of his intent would be obvious. A gift, or so he hoped, without humiliation. He waited until Clara approached his office, Maria following silently behind. Clara's eyes were cautious, weary, and alert. Edward gestured to the envelope. "This is for you," he said, voice measured. "Consider it a token of appreciation for everything you've done." Clara's hands froze mid-step. She glanced at Maria, whose small face mirrored confusion. The mother lowered her gaze and then, slowly, shook her head. "No," Clara said softly, almost reverently. "I cannot take this. I do my work honestly because it is right, not because of money. This feels like pity." Edward leaned forward, pen resting against his desk, a faint tension in his posture. "It is not pity. It is recognition. You and your daughter." Clara interrupted, voice firm, yet calm. "You may call it recognition, but to us, it is something else entirely. It carries no dignity. Money can fix bills, but it cannot teach my daughter honesty. It cannot replace the lessons we live by." Edward felt the sting of rejection. A gesture meant to solve a perceived problem had instead underscored his own inability to understand them. Clara continued, her tone steady, resolute. "We have learned to survive without handouts, to trust only in ourselves. We will not let the world believe our integrity is for sale." Edward's fingers twitched across the desk. The words struck with the force of truth, silent and unyielding. Pride, he realized, was not theirs to discard. It was a shield, and no sum of money could pierce it. Maria stepped closer, her small hand brushing her mother's sleeve. "Mama, he only wanted to help," she whispered. Clara smiled faintly, touching her daughter's shoulder. "Yes, love, but kindness can be shown without surrendering our values. We accept only what preserves who we are." Edward exhaled, leaning back in his chair. The envelope remained untouched between them, a symbol not of power, but of his own impotence. In that moment, he recognized the weight of influence without understanding. He could give money, he could give luxury, but he could not give the integrity they had earned through struggle and vigilance. Alone after their departure, Edward stared at the envelope. The bills inside lay flat, crisp but meaningless. Power, he realized, could never replace the quiet strength of principle. The fortress felt colder now, less commanding, yet more vulnerable. And in that vulnerability, Edward began to see the depth of what he had truly underestimated. The following day, Edward sat in his office, reviewing the security monitors with quiet precision. The mansion hummed with routine. Clara dusting shelves, Maria arranging flowers, staff moving through corridors with practiced care. Everything appeared ordinary. But Edward's attention was drawn to Harland, the senior butler, whose eyes lingered on the newcomers with a subtle, calculating intensity. He moved through the house with practiced grace, yet Edward noticed every hesitation, every glance meant to be unnoticed. At midday, Harland approached Edward's desk, carrying a silver tray. "Sir, I believe something troubling has come to light," he said smoothly, his voice laced with feigned concern. Edward raised an eyebrow. "Go on," he said, neutral, masking his growing suspicion. "Several items are missing," Harland continued. "Came to my attention this morning. Jewelry, small valuables. I thought it best to report it immediately. I do not wish to accuse anyone, but perhaps the new housekeeper." His gaze lingered on Clara, the implication clear, though veiled. Edward nodded slowly. "I see. Make a note. I'll review the cameras." Unseen by Harland, Edward's monitors captured the butler's actions in detail. Harland moved discreetly to the storage closet, where he placed a silver locket inside a drawer belonging to Clara. The gesture was meticulous, deliberate, a perfect setup. Edward's fingers tapped the desk, the rhythm measured and calm. He did not intervene. Not yet. The test was unfolding, and he intended to observe fully. Harland lingered, adjusting books on a shelf as though he had done nothing. From the camera's perspective, every move was captured, every false step recorded. Edward felt a rare sensation, quiet anticipation, tempered by the weight of responsibility. The child, Maria, was nearby, her curiosity always alert. If she noticed, Edward knew she would see more than anyone else. Later, Harland returned to the hall near the kitchen, slipping another item, a gold cufflink, into Clara's apron pocket when he believed no one watched. Edward caught the movement in slow, deliberate replay, the evidence invisible to everyone else. The senior butler's confidence grew. He believed the trap was perfect. The frame-up would appear seamless. Valuables missing, evidence planted, suspicion falling squarely on the innocent. Edward leaned back, unmoving, and let Harland proceed. Every small action, the tilt of a tray, the positioning of a drawer, the subtle glance toward the security cameras, was catalogued. He did not intervene, not yet. Observation alone was the most powerful tool. The confrontation would come, and when it did, Edward would know exactly how far Harland would go. The seeds were sown. The stage was set. Late afternoon, Edward sat in the office, quiet and still, eyes fixed on the monitors. He had anticipated the next move, the moment when Harland would believe the trap complete. It arrived minutes later. Harland strode into the main hall, holding a small silver locket in his gloved hand. His face was the picture of staged shock, concern mingled with disapproval. "Sir," he called, voice carefully pitched, "I believe this has been misplaced. Found it in the new housekeeper's belongings." Clara, standing near the staircase, froze. Her eyes widened in disbelief. Maria pressed close to her mother, small hands gripping the fabric of Clara's dress. Edward remained still, silent as stone. Harland continued, voice rising slightly to command attention. "I did not wish to accuse anyone prematurely, but the evidence is clear. Sir, I thought you should see it at once." Clara's voice trembled, low and steady. "That is impossible. I did not touch it. I have done nothing wrong. Maria's gaze flicked toward the drawer where Harlan had planted the locket. She stepped forward, small but resolute, and spoke. It wasn't her. I saw someone put it there. Harlan's eyes narrowed. And who might that be, child? I don't know his name, Maria said, tone firm, but he wore black gloves. He moved the things when no one was looking. I watched. I wrote it down. Edward's hand moved slightly to the edge of the desk, tapping once. The monitors confirmed her account. Every action she described was recorded, every movement precisely as she had said. The child's testimony was not just honest. It was specific, unwavering, detailed. The angle of the drawer, the tilt of the tray, the timing of the steps. Edward's voice finally filled the room, calm and even. I have security cameras, he said. I know exactly what happened. Harlan stiffened, face paling as the weight of surveillance. And now the child's testimony bore down. He opened his mouth to protest, then closed it, realizing the evidence was irrefutable. Clara exhaled softly, relief washing through her. Maria returned to her side, small hand clasped in her mother's. Edward leaned back, eyes steady. The envelope of silence, the fortress of observation he had maintained, had revealed the truth. Harlan's scheme crumbled not through accusation, not through confrontation, but through careful watching and the quiet integrity of a child. The hall, once tense with staged outrage, grew still. Edward understood that trust, once verified, could carry far more weight than suspicion ever could. He turned from the monitors, letting Clara and Maria gather themselves, knowing the house's balance had shifted. Prepare for the trip, Edward said aloud to Reynolds, though only the monitors and hidden microphones recorded the command. Leave the house open. Observe carefully. Nothing is accidental. Minutes later, Edward executed the ruse. He left word that he would be out of town for meetings, though in truth, he remained in the mansion, hidden. Harlan, satisfied and confident, relaxed his vigilance. Through the cameras, Edward watched as the butler assembled a small covert team. Their movements were precise, coordinated, black gloves, duffel bags, flash drives. Harlan's plan had never been merely to frame Clara. He sought corporate secrets, documents, contracts, financial files, exploiting the pretense of a domestic theft to cover professional espionage. They slipped into Edward's private study, bypassing ordinary locks, confident no one was watching. Edward's pulse remained steady, his mind methodical, tracking each step. The security system recorded everything, every pause and glance, every subtle hand movement. Meanwhile, Clara and Maria returned to the mansion for an innocuous reason. The child had left her notebook in the study, eager to continue cataloging small curiosities. They stepped lightly, unaware of the intruders inside. Edward's breath caught slightly. The collision of innocent presence and malicious intent created a tense tableau. He could not risk the family, yet he allowed them to move, knowing timing would expose the full extent of Harlan's gambit. The intruders began placing documents into their bags, confident their deception would go unnoticed. Harlan moved among them, directing the effort with a cold precision that betrayed his earlier facade of loyalty. Every subtle gesture was captured on camera, known only to Edward. Maria paused in the doorway, her eyes widening. She noticed the movement, the unnatural gestures. Her small hands clenched the notebook against her chest, as if it were a shield. Clara stepped forward, protective instinct rising, unaware of the danger, but sensing tension in the air. Edward exhaled, calm but resolute. The trap had fully revealed itself. Not just a petty theft, but a premeditated breach of trust on multiple levels. Harlan's overconfidence would become his undoing. Edward leaned back into the shadows, watching the scene unfold. The moment was approaching when intervention would be necessary. And when it came, no one would be harmed, yet the depth of Harlan's deceit would be undeniable. The fortress of observation had never been more vital. Clara and Maria entered the study, unaware of the intrusion. Maria clutched her notebook, eyes wide, sensing the tension. Clara's hand found her daughter's shoulder, protective and steady. Harlan noticed them immediately, his face hardening. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, voice sharp. "Step aside." Maria did not step back. Instead, she placed her notebook on the desk, standing tall beside her mother. "We are here," she said clearly, "and we see what you are doing." Harlan sneered, gesturing toward the intruders. "They are only doing as instructed. Move, or you'll be blamed." Edward activated the intercom system. His voice filled the study, calm, steady, resonant. "Harlan, step away from them. Now." Harlan froze. The intruders halted, startled by the unseen authority. Edward's security chief, Reynolds, emerged from the shadows with silent efficiency, guiding the family to safety while keeping eyes on the intruders. "You thought this house would obey your deception," Edward continued, voice over the intercom. "You underestimated observation, and you underestimated the integrity of those you sought to frame." Harlan's confidence faltered. He made a final move toward a drawer, but Reynolds intercepted him, forcing him back. The intruders, realizing the operation had failed, hesitated, unsure of the next step. Maria stepped forward, notebook held high. She recited quietly but firmly the actions she had observed. Dates, times, every subtle motion. Her voice, small yet unwavering, pierced the tension. The intruders' carefully orchestrated plan unraveled under the weight of truth. Edward's eyes remained on the monitors, confirming each detail, each captured movement. The law had been summoned. The police arrived swiftly, arresting the intruders and Harlan in a precise, controlled operation. Clara pulled Maria close, breathing shallow but steady. Edward stepped from shadows into the room, observing them both. The family's fear had been replaced by relief, yet their dignity remained intact. Edward finally allowed himself a faint exhale. The fortress of silence, observation, and calculation had worked. Trust had been tested and upheld. Deceit had been exposed, not through violence, but through preparation, vigilance, and truth. The mansion was quiet again, the echoes of confrontation fading. Edward watched Clara and Maria, realizing the family's strength, their integrity and courage, had shifted the balance of power in ways no money nor manipulation could achieve. The final confrontation was over. The threat neutralized. The house and the family within it were safe. Clara and Maria sat together on the velvet settee, a small, steady calm settling over them. Maria opened her notebook, the leather cover worn at the corners, the pages filled with neat, precise handwriting. Each entry documented what she had observed. Times, movements, small details invisible to most adults. Every gesture of Harlan, every planted item, every subtle misdirection now formed a clear record of intent. Edward leaned against the desk, arms crossed, watching. The child's diligence amazed him. This was not mere note-taking. It was a meticulous chronicle of truth, a record that would leave no shadow of doubt. Clara touched the notebook gently. "Maria, you don't have to read all of this aloud," she said softly. Maria shook her head. "I need to. They need to know exactly what happened." The detective assigned to the case stepped into the room, eyes scanning the notebook, then shifting to Edward. "You have your security feeds, of course," he said cautiously. "Yes," Edward replied, voice even. "But this belongs to her. Every detail is hers. Every observation, every truth she preserved when no one else could." Maria began reading. Dates, times, the subtle positioning of trays, the tilt of drawers, the way gloves hid fingerprints. Her voice was calm, factual, unwavering. The detective's eyebrows rose, surprise evident, then shifted to respect. "She's right," he said finally, leaning over the pages. "This is comprehensive, accurate, verifiable." Edward watched as Clara's chest rose and fell slowly. Her pride was quiet, contained, but present. Maria's small hands remained steady on the notebook, a shield of integrity in a world that had tried to exploit her family. Edward realized the full weight of the moment. The notebook was more than evidence. It was a testament to resilience, to the careful cultivation of honesty, to the quiet strength of those overlooked. The detective closed the notebook carefully. This will be entered into evidence. Her testimony, supported by her own observations, will form the cornerstone of the case. Maria nodded, her small face serious. Who would believe us if we didn't write it down? Edward felt a profound stir within him. For years, he had measured people by suspicion and cynicism. Here, a child's steadfast integrity had done what his wealth, his power, and his vigilance could not. It had preserved truth. The envelope of silence in the office felt lighter now, the fortress inside Edward cracking further, reshaping in ways he had not imagined. In the quiet, Edward knew the first victory had been achieved. Not with money, not with force, but with observation, patience, and a child's unwavering honesty. Weeks later, the courtroom was hushed, heavy with anticipation. The gallery held not only Edward and the Mendoza family, but also several victims from Harlan's past. People who had suffered from the butler's schemes, silenced by fear or disbelief. Maria sat beside Clara, notebook in hand, her small frame tense but composed. Edward observed from the front row, expression restrained, but his eyes followed every movement of the room, every detail, as if cataloging it for the fortress in his mind. The judge called the session to order. Harlan, in dark formal attire, appeared confident, attempting the mask of control. Yet the tension in his shoulders betrayed him, a subtle quiver betraying his fear of exposure. When the prosecution called Maria to the stand, she rose without hesitation. Her hands clutched the notebook, voice steady, precise, unwavering. She recounted every observation, the movements of Harlan, the planting of items, the coordination of his accomplices, the timing and sequence of each deliberate act. The courtroom listened, rapt. The adults were silent, eyes widening at the clarity and detail of a child's testimony. Each fact she spoke carried weight beyond her years. Her integrity illuminated the depth of the conspiracy, exposing not just theft, but a pattern of deliberate manipulation and deceit. Harlan's composure cracked. His face reddened, lips pressed tight, hands fidgeting with the edge of his jacket. When cross-examined, his answers faltered under the precise recollection of a child. The judge leaned forward, voice measured. "Do you understand the gravity of your actions, Mr. Harlan?" Harlan's mouth opened, then closed. Anger flared, then desperation. I was only trying to protect the household. I was careful, precise. Everything was necessary." Maria's eyes did not waver. Calmly, she added, "You did not protect anyone. You tried to blame them so no one would notice what you were really doing." The courtroom fell silent. Murmurs spread, but Edward remained still, absorbing the resonance of the truth. The weight of observation, honesty, and courage had overtaken deception. The judge's gavel struck. Bail is denied. The systematic actions of Mr. Harlan and his accomplices have endangered lives and violated the trust of multiple parties. This court finds sufficient evidence to proceed with full charges of theft, fraud, and conspiracy. Harlan sagged in his seat, defeated, his entire scheme unraveling in the light of a child's integrity. Edward exhaled slowly, feeling a profound sense of closure. Clara squeezed Maria's hand gently, pride shining in her exhausted, yet steadfast expression. The victims in the gallery nodded quietly, vindicated. The legal battle was won. The truth had prevailed, not through force, nor wealth, but through meticulous observation and unwavering honesty. Edward realized, in this moment, that the fortress he had built around his own heart had begun to crumble, finally making room for trust, for connection, for the possibility of family. Weeks after the trial, Edward requested Clara and Maria meet him in his study. The room was brighter now, sunlight spilling over polished surfaces. Yet the space retained its quiet, orderly dignity, reflecting Edward's own nature, controlled, deliberate, precise. Clara and Maria entered, Maria clutching her notebook as always. Edward rose, his tall frame casting a long shadow over the desk. He gestured for them to sit. "I have watched your courage," he said, voice measured, "and the way you preserve truth, even under threat. Integrity is rare, It deserves recognition, not pity. Clara inclined her head, wary but attentive. Edward opened a folder and laid out documents. An offer of employment as household manager for Clara, with full autonomy over staff and schedules, framed not as charity, but acknowledgement of her skill and principled leadership. Maria looked up, eyes wide. Edward continued, speaking to her gently, as one might to an apprentice. And for you, Maria, a scholarship to continue your education. An investment, not a gift. You have demonstrated the discipline and honesty most adults lack. Clara's hands trembled slightly. She had refused handouts before, but this, merit-based recognition, was different. It preserved dignity while offering opportunity. Edward shifted, pulling another envelope from the desk. Medical bills for Clara's mother were settled, quietly, discreetly. This addresses your most pressing concern, he said softly. It is part of the investment in your future, not charity. Your values remain intact. Clara exhaled, the weight on her shoulders lifting. I don't know what to say, she whispered, eyes glistening. We've never received help in this way before. Without strings attached. Edward inclined his head slightly. We are not accustomed to expecting trust, but your integrity has earned it. It is not my gift. It is your right, earned through action. Maria's small hand reached out, brushing Edward's sleeve briefly. It was simple, unspoken acknowledgement. No words were needed. Gratitude and connection radiated quietly from the gesture. Clara finally nodded, composure returning. Tears formed, but her posture remained dignified. We accept, she said, voice steady. We will honor this opportunity and your trust. Edward returned to his desk, watching them with measured satisfaction. This was not charity. This was recognition, earned and preserved, a tangible acknowledgement of courage, honesty, and resilience. For the first time, he realized that influence could be wielded without domination, that power could elevate rather than diminish. The family had been tested, vindicated, and now elevated, all without compromise to their values. The fortress within him shifted. Observation had given way to action. Integrity had been rewarded. Trust had been validated. And in that quiet, deliberate moment, Edward understood that the true reward was not power, nor wealth, but the restoration of dignity for others and, unexpectedly, for himself. Several months later, the mansion felt different, not because of structural changes, but because of the people within it. Clara moved through the halls with quiet authority, her new role as household manager evident in the way staff responded to her directions. She carried herself with a balance of dignity and calm, the weight of past struggle replaced by earned confidence. Maria thrived at her new school, her uniform neat, her backpack well-worn but orderly. She carried herself with the same precision she had displayed in documenting Harlan's schemes, now applied to studies, friendships, and everyday life. One afternoon, Edward received an invitation to a family gathering at the Mendoza household. It was informal, warm, and alive with the laughter generations. The scent of cooked food and the hum of conversation were foreign to the cold, silent corridors of his mansion. He arrived in his tailored navy suit, the stiffness of old habits evident in his posture. Clara greeted him at the door, a smile softening her face. Maria ran ahead, then returned to tug gently at his hand, leading him toward the kitchen. The grandmother, frail but radiant, extended a hand toward Edward. "We've been waiting for you," she said warmly, her voice rich with affection. "Come, be part of our family." Edward, and used to such open warmth, hesitated for a moment. Then, slowly, he stepped inside, guided by Maria and Clara. The space was alive with connection, a stark contrast to the sterile perfection of his mansion. As they gathered for a simple meal, Edward observed quietly. Laughter, shared stories, gentle teasing. It was chaotic, imperfect, and human. He realized, with a quiet astonishment, that this was a family in full motion, and he was part of it. Maria leaned against him briefly, whispering a comment about her school project. Edward felt the warmth of trust, the comfort of belonging, and the unfamiliar ease of laughter joining him instead of observing from a distance. The grandmother formally adopted him into their circle, not with ceremony, but with presence, with acknowledgement, with invitation. Edward, ever precise, ever watchful, accepted. By evening, he found himself seated in the midst of conversation, participating naturally, offering small smiles, and even soft laughter. The rigid walls he had carried for decades began to dissolve, replaced by the understanding that family was not about possession or control, but presence and connection. Edward looked at Maria and Clara, sensing the subtle but profound transformation, from observers and protectors to trusted companions. He realized that in joining their family, he was no longer merely a distant benefactor or careful overseer. He was finally a participant. For the first time in decades, he felt an unfamiliar, grounding warmth, the quiet certainty of being welcomed, not as a guest, but as family. Edward sat alone in his office late one evening. The mansion was quiet, illuminated only by the soft glow of the desk lamp. On the polished surface lay a small drawing Maria had given him, a simple sketch of a house with the words, "Family is trust." He stared at it for several minutes, absorbing the innocent clarity of her observation. The lines were uneven, the handwriting slightly wobbly, yet the message was undeniable. He had spent decades building walls, crafting barriers to protect himself from betrayal. Now, he realized, the walls had begun to crumble from within, their purpose replaced by something far more vital: connection. The mansion itself reflected the change. The once sterile rooms now carried warmth. The faint scent of home-cooked meals, the soft hum of conversation, the echo of small laughter bouncing off walls that had previously only reflected authority. Edward took a deep breath, then reached for the phone. He dialed a number he had not called in years. The line rang once, twice, before a familiar voice answered. Hesitant, guarded. "Hello. Hello," Edward said, his voice steady but softer than usual. "It's me. I built walls so high, I forgot there were good people on the other side. I was wrong." A pause followed. Then, cautiously, the other voice replied, tentative but hopeful. "Edward, is that really you?" "Yes," he said. "I want to try again. I want to rebuild, if you're willing." As the conversation continued, Edward felt a shift inside himself, a surrender of the meticulous control he had clung to for decades. Connection was riskier than isolation, yes, but infinitely more vital. He glanced at the small safe in the corner of the room. For years, it had been a symbol of security, of control, of mistrust. Now it sat unused, irrelevant. True security was no longer stored behind metal and locks. It was present in moments of honesty, in shared trust, in unguarded conversation. Edward leaned back in his chair, absorbing the quiet, deliberate weight of this revelation. The fortress he had spent a lifetime maintaining was no longer necessary. Observation, vigilance, and preparation had served their purpose. But now there was room for something new. Faith in people, trust in family, and the courage to let others in. He looked again at Maria's drawing. The message was simple, yet profound. Walls could protect, yes, but they could also isolate. And Edward, finally, understood that the truest strength lay in tearing them down. For the first time, he felt unshackled. He was not merely wealthy, not merely powerful. He was present, connected, alive in ways he had never allowed himself to be. The walls had come down. Sunday morning. Sunlight streamed through the wide kitchen windows of the Mendoza household. The room was alive with quiet chatter, the scent of baking bread and brewed coffee filling the space. Edward sat at the large wooden table, a place he had never imagined occupying, surrounded by Clara, Maria, and the grandmother. The air was informal, warm, alive with connection rather than protocol. Plates clinked, mugs steamed, and the conversation flowed easily, punctuated by laughter. Edward listened more than he spoke, observing, but now as a participant rather than a distant overseer. Maria, sitting across from him, looked up from her coloring book. "You don't look lonely anymore," she said simply. The words mirrored her first piercing question weeks ago. now reframed as an observation of transformation. Edward felt a quiet smile rise unbidden. He answered with a nod, voice low but genuine. "No, I don't." Clara caught his gaze, her smile steady, warm. "It's good to have you here," she said softly. The grandmother, still frail but vibrant in spirit, reached across the table to tap Edward's hand gently. "We've waited a long time for you to be part of us," she said. "And now you are." Edward watched the scene, absorbing the quiet rhythm of home. The mansion he had once controlled with paranoia and now felt distant, irrelevant. Real security was not in locks or monitors, not in wealth or isolation. It was here, in this room, in the simple presence of family, trust, and shared moments. After breakfast, as the family began tidying the table together, Maria climbed on Edward's lap briefly, a small hug. It was natural, unforced, comfortable. He returned it with a steady, gentle embrace, realizing fully that this bond had been earned, cultivated, and now freely given. Edward glanced around the room. Laughter echoed, conversations intertwined, and the grandmother's soft humming filled the air. The home was not perfect. It was alive, flawed, human, and Edward felt, in a profound way, that he belonged. For decades, he had tested others, measured integrity, built walls, and observed silently from a distance. Now he participated. He contributed. He was present. As the family gathered their plates and prepared to move to the garden, Edward's eyes lingered on the small drawing Maria had given him months before. Family is trust. He realized that the story of the child he had once tested had become his own story. The lesson he had imposed on others had been returned, larger and more profound. Faith is not in money, nor power, but in the goodness of people. Edward rose from the table as the family left for the garden. He followed, smiling, no longer an observer, but a part of the rhythm of life, trust, and home. The mansion was no longer a fortress. Edward had passed his own test, discovering what he had never allowed himself before. That love, connection, and trust were the true measure of wealth. The home was complete. Thank you for following this story. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe and share your thoughts below. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. Stay tuned for more immersive stories.